Hello, and welcome to European SharePoint Training Week, a week of live webinars, ebooks and blogs from the top SharePoint experts in the industry. Today I'm delighted to be joined by Symon Garfield, who will be talking to you about Knowledge is Power, the Rise of the Social Business. Remember to join in the conversation about today's webinar on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @EuropeanSP and our hashtag is ESPC14. Symon is one of an impressive list of speakers for the European SharePoint Conference, which will take place in Barcelona, May 5 to 8, 2014. Go to www.sharepointeurope.com for more information on the 100 plus sessions that will take place. All of the speakers from European SharePoint Training Week will be there, along with the likes of Dan Holm, Jeremy Tague, Christian Buckley and Rafael Lukovicskia. After the webinar we will have questions. Type any questions you have for Symon in the question pane in the control panel. Some questions will be selected and answered at the end of the presentation. This webinar is being recorded and you will be notified by email when it is available. And now I'm going to pass over to our webinar presenter, Symon Garfield. Hello Symon.
Hi Declan. Hello everybody. Just going to switch over so you'll be able to see my screen. Has that come through for you, Declan?
Yes, that's fine, Symon.
Good stuff. Okay, so off we go. So good morning, everybody, wherever you are. As Declan said, my name's Symon Garfield. I'm talking to you from Hook, which is near Reading. I'm talking to you from my office at home, which gives me the advantage of being able to do this webinar completely naked. So the hashtag for this is hashtag naked webinar. And if you're at home, I'd encourage you to loosen your clothing as well and just relax. If you're in the office, it's probably best that you don't do that, but you might want to just remove a few items, in which case the hashtag would be SharePoint in my pants. Hopefully at this point everybody's laughing, but the other thing about doing a webinar is you've got no idea whether the jokes go down well or not. So I'm just going to plow on them with the jokes regardless. Very brief introduction to myself. If you're really desperate to know anything about me, then I'm the only Symon Garfield in the world, it seems, that spells my name S-Y-M-O-N. So you can use a search engine of your choice and search for me, and everything you find on the internet that's about Symon with a Y Garfield is me, including one particular story which I've been trying to get the author to take down for some years, but unfortunately they won't take it down because they argue that the story appeared in a national newspaper and it's therefore fair game. So I'll leave you to find that one for yourself. A very quick bit of background. I was working as a software engineer back in 2005 writing VB6 code. I did an MBA. As part of the MBA I got interested in knowledge management, and around about the same time a recruitment consultant told me that there was a hot market called for a product called SharePoint Portal Server 2003. So I looked into it and realized that SharePoint was basically a set of software tools for doing knowledge management with, and made the connection with the work that I'd been doing as part of my MBA. So since then, which was 2005, 2006, I've been working as a consultant doing management consultancy as opposed to technology consultancy around SharePoint, and the basic thrust of my work is how organizations get business value out of the investments that they're making in Microsoft technologies and SharePoint specifically. These days, if we just take a quick look at some of the stuff on the slide, I've recently started work for Wipro, so I advise clients in the banking sector across the UK and Europe on how to use Microsoft technologies, and SharePoint is still a very big part of what I do. I work with Microsoft as what they call a VTSP, which is basically I get to go in and support the Microsoft sales teams talking to their customers. I lead the one of 4 leaders of the SharePoint user group in London. We have a meeting this evening starting at 6 o'clock at Microsoft's offices. If you're in London, feel free to pop along. I write articles for CMS Wire, and the subject of the talk today is actually also the subject of a series of currently 3 articles on CMS Wire, so you can look those up. Microsoft have very kindly awarded me the MVP status for the last 2 years, and most importantly in terms of today's conversation, I'm currently studying or doing research for a DBA, which is a Doctorate of Business Administration at Henley Business School. and the subject of my research is enterprise social and knowledge management with social tools. And today's presentation is really a summary of where I'm up to in that research. The very first thing that you have to do as part of a research program is go out and read everything which has already been written on your particular subject. Then you come up with a question, and then you go off and do your research to answer the question. So in terms of that doctorate, I've been doing it for just over a year, and at the moment I've just finished that first stage, which is what they call the literature review. And the contents of this presentation is basically a summary of that literature review and what I found out so far. Please feel free to reach out, connect, communicate and collaborate. As I said, I'm the only Symon Garfield in the world that spells my name Symon, so I'm pretty easy to find and available on all of the more fashionable social media channels. Okay, so the point of today's presentation then. So why am I here? So a lot of text on the screen. This is the problem statement that I've come up with as the starting point for my research. So as you can see, the perceived problem is that the phenomena of social business is not well understood within the context of strategic management, and that as a result, significant amounts of time, effort, and money are being wasted, and the opportunities are being missed. So after about 14 months of study, what you can see there is pretty much the sum total of where I've got up to. I've managed to identify a problem. Nobody ever said that academic study was quick. So in researching that problem, as I said, I've gone out and read lots of academic literature going back over many years and research that's been done in areas that would affect social. And what I've done is I've taken all of the stuff that I've read and shoehorned it into 4 buckets, which are strategy, knowledge and learning, people, and technology. And that's going to be the structure that I'm going to use for today's presentation. Okay, so first of all, just a little bit of context then, a little bit of background. So the rise of the social business. So in doing my research, what I'm doing is I'm effectively training to be a social scientist, and being a scientist is fun. People say to me, Symon, they say, what is a scientist exactly? What do you mean by that? And my answer to that question is that science is basically about finding out how things work. And as a scientist, that's, as a social scientist, that's my role. So the first thing I did was I went off and I thought, okay, social business. I thought, well, starting point, what is a business? Which might sound like a pretty basic and fundamental question. Now, all of my other slides in this presentation are going to be based on what they call 3- or 4-star academic research, which is basically top quality peer-reviewed journals. This one slide, I've actually used Wikipedia as the main source of information. So if you look on Wikipedia and look at businesses, you say, what is a business? Basically, a business is a group of people that come together for the purpose of carrying out some sort of commerce or trade, and a family business is a good example. Beyond that, you then get to the idea of a corporation, and a corporation is an organization which has a legal is a legal entity and an existence beyond that of its members. So for instance, if people die, the business continues. And there's examples of corporations apparently going back to early Roman times and going through medieval times. Apparently a lot of corporations came into being when the European countries went off and did colonial ventures. So we had the British and the East India companies, for example, that were incorporated to carry on trade with India. Now, in around about 1895, there was a guy called George Symon, who was the head of Deutsche Bank, and you may recognize the name Siemens. His cousin ran an electronics or an electrics business, and his cousin's son had run that business into the ground. And they came to him and asked him for a loan to bail the business out. And he gave them a loan on condition that they handed over the running of the business to somebody else, which they did. And effectively, that's how we invented management. We separated ownership of the business from the running of the business. Then in round about 1925, Pierre S. Dupont restructured his family business and introduced a mechanism of bureaucracy and hierarchy based around the mechanisms to do with breaking up budgets. And that was really the start of the modern organisation that we would recognise today. Other organisations such as General Electric and General Motors took on that kind of model, and around about 1950 most organisations were structured in that way. So that was really when we had what we would recognise as the modern organisation. Then IT came along into business in kind of the 1970s and 1980s, and some people, we'll talk about this in more detail in a moment, but some people started talking about information-based organisations, and then more recently, since around about 2006, people have been talking about Enterprise 2.0, or more commonly these days, they talk about social business, or if you're Microsoft, of course, they talk about enterprise social. And I can see a few people in the chat window saying that they're naked. So hurrah for being naked, but please be careful with any hot drinks, and whatever you do, don't press the share webcam button. That wouldn't be good. Okay, so 1988, the new organisation. So Peter Drucker, who's the guy that was widely credited with coming up with the phrase knowledge worker, brought out a paper in the Harvard Business Review in 1988 called The New Organisation, or The Coming of the New Organisation. And what he was talking about there was what was going to happen to organisations when IT moved out of the back office functions, data processing such as wage processing and salary processing, and we moved towards management information systems. And we started to get desktop computers and client-server type architecture. And he said that what that did was it effectively flattened hierarchies, and that it made information more democratic. Now, that sounds probably very familiar to anybody that's been listening to the rhetoric around social in the last few years. But remember, this is the Drucker talking in 1988. And one of the effects that he said that this would have on organizations, he said it would stop organizations from being akin to a military organization with command and control, and it would move more to a situation, the metaphor he used is that organizations would become much more like orchestras, where the leader is the conductor, and the workers in the orchestra, the knowledge workers, become specialists. And that the leader's job, the conductor's job, is to coordinate the activities of a group of specialists. So he identified, he said there's lots of potential with this new type of organisation, but he identified a number of challenges, and that's what you can see on the slide. So the first one, he said, is how do you develop the rewards, recognition and career opportunities for specialists? And again, returning to the idea of the orchestra, if you play, let's say, the French horn, random example, if you might be on the second French horn, you might progress to the first French horn, you may even move to a better orchestra. But without that hierarchy to move up through the levels of management, it becomes difficult to understand how people would be rewarded, because they can't look forward to continual promotion through their career. So that was the first challenge. How do you reward people? The second challenge was related to management, and again, this is coming back to the idea of the conductor, and that's how do the leaders of these new organisations create a unified vision that binds all of these specialists together and coordinates their activities. And finally, he talked about how do you devise the management structure for an organisation of what he called task forces, and today we probably recognise that as being a matrix structure based around projects. So the key point here is that as far back as 1988, people were saying things like democratising information and flattening organisations, and moving away from hierarchy. There's lots of potential identified, but there's also a number of challenges identified. The next kind of milestone really was in 2006, where Professor Andrew McAfee published an article, first of all, an article in MIT Sloan Management Review that later became a book called Enterprise 2.0. And he was looking specifically, his research was looking specifically at the use of Web 2.0 technologies inside organizations. And he was looking at things like the use of blogs, wikis, and those types of technologies. This was slightly before enterprise social networking had really become mainstream with things like Facebook. And as you can see, this is the conclusion from his research. It says Enterprise 2.0 technologies have the potential to usher in a new era, but because of the challenges these technologies bring, there will be significant differences in companies' abilities to exploit them, but because of the opportunities, it will matter a great deal. So basically, he's again saying there's a lot of opportunity, but there are also a number of challenges, and it's difficult to realize the benefits that these new technologies offer. And the sorts of challenges that he identified was, first of all, the challenge of user adoption. So he was talking about blogs and wikis in particular, and he said, look, on the internet, where you've got millions of people, you've got enough people that contribute and create content. If you put the technology inside an organization, then the challenge there is, will you have enough people in your organization that will actually create the content on your corporate wiki or corporate blog, because most people are actually consumers of content, not creators. Pause for a cup of coffee. The other challenge that he identified was, he said, well, if you do get people to use the technology, how are management going to deal with it if people decide to use that technology to voice dissent? So, for instance, if somebody uses a wiki or a blog to post opposing views against the corporate message that comes down from leadership, how do you deal with that? So again, opportunities and challenges. More recently, there was a case study done in 2011 where some researchers looked at an organization, a global telecoms company, which apparently is held up as a shining example of a social business. And they actually worked in the organization and did a case study on their own organization and looked into the benefits that social business was producing for their business. And they concluded from their case study that, again, Enterprise 2.0 technologies have considerable promise for redefining the workplace, but achieving the elusive goals will be dependent on a reconfiguration and a redesign of the whole socio-technical and managerial system. So they were saying that even for an organization which is supposed to be really good at doing social, actually we're not getting the benefits, because it's about much more than just the technology. It's about how you manage people, and it's about the leadership and the management environment that's created around the technology. Bringing it right up to date, there was a report that came out recently. It's not academic research, it's more like market research, but it was run by MIT Sloan Management's review in conjunction with Deloitte, and they went out and surveyed a number of executives, and they came back, their survey showed that all of the executives said that social business was very important to their organizations. It was even more important than it had been last year when the survey was run, but actually not many of them were doing anything in terms of becoming a social business. And the survey identified three blockers or three problems that were preventing people or organizations from becoming social. And the first one was no clear strategy, no clear business case or value proposition, and competing priorities, which, if you summarize it to me, says no clear strategy, we don't know what we're doing, no clear business case, we don't know why we're doing it, and competing priorities means so we're going to go do something else instead. Finally, just to sum this up, I saw an article recently published, well, in 2012, on the Forbes website, where a well-known journalist had gone off and interviewed an executive of an organization which had apparently become very successful using social technologies. And that executive, this is a quote from that executive that was published on the website, and he said, in reference to social, you can't stop it. Once you make it available to the people, the magic happens. Sometimes if you ask me to quantify in euros or dollars what the platform has delivered, I tell them to look at the change in mindset, the information sharing, and how quickly information passes around. Now, this particular quote really gets my goat, winds me up a little bit, because as you can see, I've picked out the emphasis on the magic happens. I don't believe in magic, and I certainly don't think that we should be basing our enterprise strategy or our deployment of enterprise software on the fact that magic will happen. And if you look at the rest of the quotes, where he says, if people ask me to quantify in euros or dollars what the platform has delivered, he actually can't tell you. As far as that quote and the rest of the article is concerned, he doesn't know what he was trying to achieve in the first place, and he's got no real way of measuring whether or not he's actually created any benefit whatsoever. And I don't think that's a great place for the industry or for organisations to be. And it was actually this particular article that really kind of set the agenda for the research that I'm doing as part of my doctorate, because I want to be able to solve that particular problem. So, as I said, off I went, and I've done lots of reading over the last year, and the things that I've found I've now structured into these 4 buckets. So the first one of those is strategy. And I have just one slide on strategy. So this is looking at the field of strategic management. And in strategic management research, one of the main questions, one of the most fundamental questions, is how do organisations create and sustain competitive advantage? And I've kind of taken that as a starting point for my research in terms of what are we actually trying to achieve. So I thought I'd look at strategic management. So if you look at the literature around strategic management, very briefly, there's pretty much 4 schools of thought or 4 perspectives. The first one is market positioning, which is basically an external view. If anybody's done any business courses or done anything at college around corporate strategy, you probably have heard of Michael Porter and 5 forces analysis and things like that. And this is market positioning. It's an external view, and basically it says go and look at the dynamics of a market, look how competitive it is, look at the power of buyers and suppliers, choose your market and enter a market which has good market conditions, and you will be successful. That was one school of thought. Then you've got the idea of strategic conflict. This is basically where people compare strategy to chess. So the idea is you look at what your competitors are doing and you counter their moves. So as an example at the moment, for instance, Apple are making good headway in entering into the enterprise because people are taking iPhones and iPads to work. Microsoft perceive that to be a threat to them because their stronghold is in the enterprise. So in order to counter that move or that threat from Apple, they've gone and brought out the Surface tablets, and you can judge for yourself how successful that's been. But I absolutely love mine and think that everybody should rush out and buy one. And of course, they've gone now and purchased the mobile phone part of Nokia as well, in a direct counter to Apple. It starts to get interesting for us, if you're not interested already, in around about the 1980s, where some people came along, did some research, and they said, look, the way it's not about looking externally in order to be competitive. What you need to do is you need to look internally at your organisation, and competitive advantage, they said, is created by gathering together strategic resources, and it's all about having resources which are valuable, rare, inimitable, so they can't be copied, and non-substitutionable. If you gather together all of these resources, the researchers said, then you will become competitive and you're in a good position. So everybody went along with that. They thought it was a great idea until around about the 1990s, where some more people came along and they said, actually, the organizations that are successful in dynamic global marketplaces aren't those that gather together resources. They're the ones that actually have the ability to sense change in the environment and to change and react to changing market conditions. And they came up with this phrase, dynamic capabilities. Now, dynamic capabilities are about earning money tomorrow. It's how we change. And they're compared to operational capabilities, which is about how we earn money today. And in my very simple terms, the way I explain this is operational capabilities are typically related to productivity, reducing costs and improving efficiencies, whereas dynamic capabilities, change, is typically associated with learning and innovation. So you've got these 2 broad strategies that you can follow, productivity or innovation. That then leads me on to the second item, which is knowledge and learning. So just picking up on one of the most seminal articles or pieces of research here, piece of research done in the Harvard Business Review in 1999, and some guys went along and they had a look at how high-end consulting companies did knowledge management, and they came to the conclusion that there were 2 broad strategies that you could follow. The first one is codification, and that's the name they gave to a knowledge management strategy which was based on putting people in touch with documents. And that kind of strategy works well if you have a business model which is based on reusability and delivering the same type of solution for each client. So your focus is on standardization and reusability. If, for instance, you need to write a report for a client, the first thing you do is say, where's the last report that we wrote for the last client with this problem? Then you're probably in a situation where you're following a codification strategy based around document templates. Now, in SharePoint terms, of course, you probably want to use SharePoint's document management features and document search features in order to enable a codification strategy. That is contrasted with a personalization strategy. And a personalization strategy is based around tacit knowledge, experience, which is in people's heads. So if you offer very bespoke solutions to your clients, you're probably going to want to, when you have a new project, the first thing you probably want to do is to find the expert on that particular subject as opposed to finding a document. And in SharePoint terms, you're probably going to be focusing on people and expertise search and on my sites. And of course, more recently, with the purchase of Yammer, you're probably going to be focusing on enterprise social networks as well for sharing tacit knowledge. So those, again, are kind of two broad strategies which seem to map very well to the two competitive strategies that we talked about a moment ago. So productivity maps well to codification, and innovation seems to map quite well to personalization. So that was knowledge management. If we take a quick look and move to a different area of research, which is organizational learning, it's very closely associated with knowledge management, but not quite the same. And in organizational learning, again, we come across this idea of having two different approaches, two different strategies. So the first one is what you call an exploitation strategy. An exploitation strategy is all based around leveraging knowledge which you already have. So for instance, think about sharing best practices, for example. An idea that worked well in one part of the business might work well in another part of the business. So how do you share that learning and that knowledge across the different parts of the business? And that seems to map quite well for me back to codification and back to productivity. The alternative strategy in organizational learning is exploration. And exploration is all about creating new knowledge and innovation. Now, the research in this area says that doing exploitation and exploration at the same time is very, very difficult. Some people say it's almost impossible because you need a kind of a different mindset and a different set of tools to follow these two different strategies. But there are a couple of ways that you might try and do both of these things together, or the way that you might combine them. So the first one here is structural ambidexterity, which basically says that you might have a different strategy, a different learning strategy for different business units or departments. So for instance, in R&D, where innovation is probably going to be important, you might have a set of tools and management practices that are based around exploration, so creating new knowledge. Whereas in something like a back office function like HR or something like sales, for instance, where it's about efficiencies and cost reduction, then you might be following an exploitation strategy. So the structural ambidexterity is about having a different set of tools and practices in different business units, geographies, or functions. Contextual ambidexterity is a bit more complicated. And this is basically where the organization says, look, we're going to provide a complete set of tools to either do exploitation or exploration, but we leave it to you, the knowledge worker, to decide which is the right set of tools to use at the right time, depending on the context or the work that you're trying to do. But again, we see with exploitation and exploration this duality which matches up well to codification and personalization and productivity and innovation. So moving on to the next set then, people. So there's a paper that came out in 1999, again from Peter Drucker, and what he did was he drew attention to the differences between knowledge workers and manual workers or factory workers, and in quite a famous paper he said, that the greatest management challenge, note management challenge, of the current century is to achieve a 50% increase in productivity in the same way that management did in the past century. Sorry, a 50% improvement in the productivity of knowledge workers in the same way that they'd produced a 50% increase in the productivity of manual workers in the previous century. And he said there's some challenges around doing that because knowledge workers are very different. He said, first of all, going back to this idea of knowledge workers being specialists, they know more about their job, usually, than their boss does. So that makes them more difficult to manage. And what you have to do is you have to give knowledge workers autonomy to go and do whatever it is that they need to do in order to achieve their goals and complete their tasks. He also talked about the fact that knowledge workers need to have innovation and learning as part of their jobs, and this is going back to the idea about how do you create rewards and recognitions for knowledge workers. They're not going to get promoted all the time, but for the most part knowledge workers take satisfaction from learning, from teaching, and from innovation actually being built in as part of their jobs. So the key point here is that management needs to change in order to get the best, in order to get productivity out of knowledge workers. He did also talk about the fact that with productivity, all the executives seem to say that it's important, but very few organizations can actually define it or measure it. And he made the point that the productivity of knowledge workers is dependent not only on the output, but also on the quality of the output. It has both time and quality dimensions. Just as a quick example about how that's really important, this is a couple of slides taken from a slide deck that you can find on SlideShare about Netflix. Now, Netflix have obviously done very well, where organizations such as Blockbuster, for instance, have fallen by the wayside. So Netflix have managed to adapt and change to the changing marketplaces, and they're quite famous for some of the management practices that they have. And what I have here is just a couple of examples that illustrates one way that you might go about managing knowledge workers, and it's basically, it boils down to trust. So on the left here you can see a slide that says Netflix vacation policy and tracking, and then underneath it says there is no policy and tracking. So the employees at Netflix aren't required to fill in holiday approval forms or sickness forms. Basically it's, come to work and do work when you want to, and if you don't want to come to work, then don't come to work. We measure you on your outputs, not on your inputs. And the way that they came up with this was they realized that everybody was sitting around late at night sending emails and doing work after office hours, and apparently they thought to themselves, well, if we're not measuring how many hours a day people do, then why should we bother about how many days a year they do? It doesn't make sense. So they came up with this new policy. On the right, you can see the policy for expensing entertainment, gifts, and travel. And as you can see, the policy is just five words long. It says, act in Netflix best interest. So there are some legal requirements around doing things like expenses, entertainment, and gifts. You're not allowed to go and bribe people. But apart from, within those legal constraints, there's no policy about how you should deal with your expenses. It's basically, act in the best interest of the company. So if we just kind of move on to the next argument, so one of the arguments often made by evangelists in favour of social computing and enterprise social networks is the idea that you increase productivity through the strength of weak ties. Now, weak ties came from a paper that was published in 1972 by a researcher called Granavetta, and he went off and looked into how people get jobs. So this is long before LinkedIn, and he found that people often get jobs through contacts that he described as weak ties. So if you look at the screen for a moment, you can see there on the left-hand side it says you. If you imagine that group of people there is your company or your team, if you ask people in your team about employment opportunities, they'll probably only know about the ones that you know about anyway. On the other hand, if you have links in frequent contacts with people in other teams, or other organisations, then you may find out about jobs that you wouldn't previously have been aware of. And that, in fact, is, according to this particular piece of research, how people often find jobs through their contacts, which is, of course, one of the strengths of LinkedIn. So the argument for enterprise social networking is that it gives you access to information or experts that you wouldn't previously have had access to. So it's the speed of access to information, and apparently, according to the evangelists, that increases productivity. But there's a but. So there was another piece of research done a few years later, so this is in 1999, a guy called Morton T. Hansen, who's written a very good book called Collaboration, which I highly recommend. And what he did was he had a look at not just the networks, but the information that passed around through the networks. So in knowledge management, you have this concept of codified knowledge or explicit knowledge, which can be written down, and you have the concept of tacit knowledge, which is experience-based and is very difficult to transfer. And what this particular piece of research found is that networks with weak ties are actually very bad or inefficient for transmitting tacit knowledge, but they are quite efficient for transferring codified knowledge. I mean, just to make it really simple, you might go onto your SharePoint-based intranet, you might do a search, you might locate an expert, you might then contact that expert and say, I've got this problem, can you help me out? But if the answer to your problem is really based on that expert's tacit knowledge, it's a lot of time and effort for that person to be able to transmit that knowledge to you. On the other hand, if it's as simple as, oh, well, I'll send you a PowerPoint presentation and that's all you need, if the knowledge is explicit, then that's fine. So what the slide is showing you here is you can see that there's 4 different sets of circumstances, if you like, and the bottom right-hand corner, where knowledge is codified, written down, independent, so you don't need to know other stuff in order to use it, and the tie strength is weak, then potentially you do get productivity gains from enterprise social networks, for example. But in the other set of circumstances, you don't. So the key message here is that, yes, you can get productivity gains through enterprise social networks, potentially, but it's not a question of one size fits all. It won't necessarily work for everybody or for all parts of your organization. There was, just sticking with social networks for a moment, there was some research done by a guy called Rob Cross, who's been working through around about the turn of the century and over the last 10 years. He's got a great website. You can do a search for him and find Rob Cross. And he's done lots of research into social networks, but not in the technical sense. He actually goes off and does surveys and interviews people and builds up maps of the network configuration in parts of an organization. And what he found was that different network configurations work well for different sets of circumstances. And this is very similar to what we saw around the knowledge management strategies. So working from left to right on the screen, if you're in a situation where your response to customer problems is highly customized, so it's something different every time, you can see there on the screen a picture of what he calls a customized response network. So you can see there one particular network configuration. In the middle, he's got this idea of a modular response, which is basically like having jigsaw pieces. So we've got the same components when we solve customers' problems, but each customer might require those components, a process perhaps, to be assembled in a slightly different way. And you can see that there's a different network configuration there again. Finally, on the right-hand side, you've got the idea of a routine response. So basically, we do the same thing every time a customer has a problem. And then you can see there's a very different network configuration there. So just to kind of put this into SharePoint in Yammer terms, I would say that maybe from a productivity perspective, if your business model is a routine response model, then from a productivity perspective, potentially, you're not going to get a lot of benefits from an enterprise social network. Controversial, I know. So, moving on to the next slide, there is another argument around productivity, which isn't just around access to information or expertise. The argument is often made that what you're actually going to do is get more engaged employees, and apparently engaged employees work harder for you. So This is a piece of research that looked at two organizations, did two case studies. One had been successful with an internal enterprise social network, and one had been unsuccessful. And the difference that they found was in the way that the leadership dealt with the enterprise social network. And they came up with this idea called emotional capital. Now, if you look at the screen, you can see on the top right-hand side, it says their research suggests that most successful employee communities tend to be actively managed by executives, which is perhaps slightly counterintuitive to people that think that just deploy your enterprise social network and it works from the ground up. The research shows that actually it needs to be, at least in part, if not completely, driven from the top in many cases. You need to have leadership. And what the leadership needs to do, according to this research, is to build this idea of emotional capital, and they've got 4 pillars of emotional capital. So the first one is authenticity, and basically what they're saying here is that leaders who take part on an enterprise social network or on social channels need to be consistent online with what they do offline. So in their particular research, they found that one organization, for instance, talked a lot about community spirit on the social network channel, but then actually went through a restructuring organization and made a lot of people redundant. So they weren't seen as being authentic by the community, and therefore it didn't take hold. Pride is about people feeling that their hard work and their achievements are recognized and valued by the organization. And as a very quick example, in this particular case study, the leaders that were successful used to go onto the enterprise social network and they used to say, well done to this particular team, well done to that particular salesperson, and they used to make the praise very public. And that produces feelings of pride in the employees and leads to engagement. Just got an eye on the time. We're probably going to be round about, I'll aim to wrap up in about 7 minutes or so. So we're just coming towards the end. So on the attachment side, one example that I can give you there from personal experience. So the idea of attachments is that people need to feel that they're connected to an organization that shares, or a group of people that shares the same values that they do. Now, as a quick example, people often say to me that a lot of the chatter, if you like, on enterprise social networks is inane conversation. People talking about what they had for lunch, for instance, or what they watched on the TV. And some executives say to me that they perceive that as being people wasting time talking nonsense and productivity drops. I gave a workshop a few months ago now, and I was talking to about, I don't know, 10 people for 2 hours at a client site. And at the end of it, it was on social, and at the end of the workshop, one of the guys said to me exactly that. He said, oh, all of this stuff on social networks is just a load of nonsense, people wasting time. And I said to him, I said, look, when you arrived this morning, I said, you know, we'd only just met, but when you arrived at the workshop, you told me what you did at the weekend. You went to a restaurant. You told me that the service at the restaurant was rubbish and that you won't be going back to the restaurant, but not because the service was rubbish. You won't be going back to the restaurant because your wife was so embarrassed about the way that you spoke to the waiting staff. You told me what car that you drive, and you told me that you weren't happy with the garage and that you'd taken it to a different garage to get the tyres changed because you weren't happy with the service and the cost of your usual garage. And I said to him, why did you tell me all of that? You'd just come in to have a workshop with me. And he looked a bit confused for a moment. And the point that I was trying to make is that in the course of conversation, he'd told me a lot of what you might call redundant or useless information. But the point was that that was his way of building a relationship with me. That was his way of getting to know me, of interacting with me. And exactly the same can be true on enterprise social networks. Just because people aren't talking about work doesn't mean that they're wasting their time. They're maybe building relationships. And finally, you've got the fun element, so that kind of speaks for itself. It's not all about work. Sometimes people need to, you know, to relax and have a good time together. In the interest of time, I'm just going to skip on to the final part, technology. So we haven't talked about technology yet. So we've looked at the idea, if we think back to the conversation that we had about organizational learning and ambidexterity, we had this idea of contextual ambidexterity, where organizations make available a set of different tools and management practices to allow people to either innovate or to be productive depending on their particular needs. So this idea of services then is one of the ways that I often talk to clients about how to deploy SharePoint and social technologies in particular. If I just focus in for a moment on the slide on LinkedIn and Facebook, two brands that you will know, I'm sure, very well. Effectively, they do the same thing. They've both got the ability to do status updates, to follow people, to exchange messages. You can create groups and interact with people. It's pretty much the same technology, but very different brands. So I know, for instance, if I want to share my CV with a potential employer and go and get a new job, I might post my CV on LinkedIn, but I wouldn't post my CV particularly on Facebook. On the other hand, if I wanted to have a photograph of myself dancing on a table with a pint glass on my head at a party somewhere, then not that any such photo exists, then I would post that on Facebook potentially. I certainly wouldn't post it on LinkedIn. So the point that I'm trying to make is that you've got the same technology but used in very different ways, and we use brands to position the use of the technology in the minds of the user as being for a particular purpose. And this is the way that I encourage people to use SharePoint and Yammer and Office 365 inside the organization. Those technologies are your platform, so they are the equivalent of the internet itself. And the different services or the different things that you build on the platform are the tools that the users use to solve particular business problems. And you can have different brands and different services. Some of them might be aligned to innovation, and some of them might be aligned to productivity. And it's very important that organizations make it clear to the user community which tool is for which job. And just to wrap things up, I've got a couple of examples here. So the last couple of slides now. So this is a screenshot of SharePoint Portal Server 2003. It's taken from a public case study from Unisys. I personally had nothing to do with this project. I just found this on the internet, but I'm very lucky that I've been able to connect with the guys that actually did this work and have a chat to them about how they did it. So this is a community service. Now this is all about creating communities of practice. Now of course in SharePoint 2013 we have the communities portal and the community site templates, but people were building this type of solution as far back as 2003 on SharePoint. Now I don't have time to go into the details of how this works, but basically communities of practice are a well-recognized knowledge management technique which are typically associated with innovation. So here you have a SharePoint solution which is basically aimed at innovation, one of the two competitive strategies that we've looked at. The next screenshot is taken from a project that I was involved in at a European bank, and I've done a couple of presentations around this. This is basically a solution that enables anybody in the organization to create a SharePoint team site at any time for any purpose without the need to ask IT. They can just go ahead and they can do it. So it's basically the same functionality as the community service that you've just looked at, but configured in a slightly different way. So with the community service, to create a site, you fill in a form, and you have to wait for your form to be, your request to be approved, whereas with the team service you can just fill in a form and create your own site instantly. This is typically associated with teamwork, and that's typically associated with productivity. So what you've seen in the last two examples are pretty much the same technology, one used for innovation, one used for productivity, and both branded to the users in very different ways as different tools. The users never need to know the term SharePoint any more than they need to understand how the internet works in order to be able to use Facebook or LinkedIn. I can see that I'm pretty much out of time, so I'm just going to skip through these final two slides, I think it is now. So the social networking service, this is the Yammer desktop client. My point that I want to make around enterprise social networking is that it can be used potentially either for innovation or for productivity. But my message to executives would be you need to be clear which of those two objectives you have before you deploy your enterprise social network. If you just deploy it to see what will happen, then the chances are that nothing will happen and you'll get no benefit from it. So probably enterprise social networking is more difficult to deal with because of its flexibility to be able to support either of the two strategies that we've talked about. And my final screenshot is taken from Microsoft's own internal website, internal intranet site, and they followed this idea of services and brands on their own intranet in a slightly different way than I've talked about it, but it's the same concept. And this is a screenshot of a service that they have called Academy. And basically Academy is, you can think of it as being an internal YouTube solution. Anybody can upload videos and PowerPoint decks and things like that, and it's got all of the 5-star ratings, and people who viewed this also viewed the other, that kind of recommendation system built in. And this is very much around sharing explicit knowledge, so very much a codification strategy. So again, typically associated with productivity. So I can see that we're out of time. I'll just leave the key messages up there for you to have a read through. And Declan, if you're still awake and if you still have your clothes on, I think now would be a good time to open up for questions if anyone's still with us.
I'm very much awake and naked, Simon, I can assure you. So firstly, to thank you, Simon, for a great presentation. We've had a lot of questions coming in, many of them to do with your nakedness. But I might
probably best skip over those.
I might refrain from mentioning those. Yeah, just one eagle-eyed attendee noticed on your product slide you mentioned you have a picture of Yammer, but you don't have SharePoint Social. Is there any reason for that?
No. Well, I guess the main reason would be that from Microsoft, the message most clearly is if you want to do enterprise social networking, if you want to do social, then Microsoft's roadmap is very clearly around Yammer. They are, of course, continuing to support on-premises SharePoint 2013 social and previous versions, but their roadmap is quite clear. They want everybody to move across to Yammer. So I've drank the Kool-Aid and I was promoting the Yammer message.
Okay, perfect. We've had one or two people mention that they'd love to get a copy of the slides just for the resources, so we'll make them available after the webinar.
Yep.
Another question, just what companies would you hold in high regard as good examples of social companies, Simon?
Well, okay, so in terms of social companies, so the one that springs instantly to mind actually is Unisys. So I mentioned Unisys briefly as one of the examples. I actually had the pleasure of meeting a lady called Gloria Burke at the last SharePoint conference in 2012. And Gloria had, I think a job title is Global Head of Knowledge Management and Social, something like that. And her presentation at the SharePoint 2012 conference was about how Unisys had become a social business. I actually wrote a short article on CMS Wire, which kind of covered her session. It's still available, so if you do a quick look for my name on CMS Wire, you'll find a coverage of that session. But Unisys is the one that springs instantly to mind as being held up as a good social company.
Okay, very good. Just one last question, Simon. In a company, they say the community is built for you and for the users, but I'm not sure this works. What's your opinion on that?
Sorry, could you just repeat the question for me?
The community is built, just in this particular attendee's company, they say the community is built by you and for the users, but he doesn't feel that works. What's your opinion on that?
So obviously I don't have very much information to go on with that short statement. It sounds like, what I would infer from that is it sounds like somebody, the leadership of the organisation has tried to take a kind of a bottom-up approach to building a community, and they've effectively said, look, it's built by you and it's for you, there you are, go and do what you want with it, is what it sounds like. And if we go back to the slide that I had earlier, I did say that most research shows that most successful communities are actually actively managed by the leadership. So it sounds like it's possible that that particular organisation that the question is referring to, maybe they have a lack of leadership and perhaps a lack of purpose and clear objective about what the community is for. And I would suggest that that could potentially be a challenge to the community being successful. You need leadership and you need clear purpose. And there's plenty of research to reinforce that.
Okay, thank you very much, Simon. So that's all the time we have today for our questions. I'll just leave Simon do his thank you slide.
There we go.
Yeah. If you want to go ahead there, Simon.
Yeah, well, that's it. As I say, I mean, just thanks for everybody who's tuned in. Thank you to those that have gone with the naked thing. I look forward to having a look at the Twitter feed, and I hope nobody's posted any photographs.
I sincerely hope so too. And before we go, I just have one question for you all. Are you coming to Barcelona? For those of you that
Barcelona.
everyone, Simon. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
For those of you that don't know, the European SharePoint Conference 2014 will take place from the 5th to 8th of May 2014 in beautiful Barcelona. For more information about what you can expect at Europe's largest SharePoint conference, check out our website www.sharepointeurope.com. Currently, we have a range of competitive pricing options with our great early booking offer. Get a 3-day delegate pass from only $9.95. We also have some fantastic group booking offers available. The bigger your group, the bigger the discount. Check out our pricing page for more information. That's all for today's webinar. Thank you for joining us this week for European SharePoint Training Week. And today is a special treat for all attendees. We are releasing lots of fresh new content, so make sure to go to www.sharepointeurope.com for free ebooks and blogs. Goodbye.